On moonlit nights on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Holy Rosary Mission School graveyard could be seen clearly through the tall windows of our third-floor dormitory. As the moonlight reflected off of the tombstones, those of us sleeping near the big windows hid our heads under the covers. One night, many years ago, a Jesuit priest saw something burning in the graveyard. He went to investigate and saw the image of the devil glowing on a tombstone. He put out the fire and called a brother to chisel out the image of the devil off of the tombstone. To this very day, if one comes across that tombstone, the face of the devil, now nearly obliterated, can still be seen, and the tips of its horns are still visible. One Halloween night, KEVN-TV in Rapid City sent a news team to the mission school to tape the image of the tombstone for the nightly news. There were many spooky stories that emanated from the mission boarding school, now being called Red Cloud. One story I could verify was the organ that played eerie tunes and could be heard in our dormitory into the wee hours of the night. One of the more popular stories, again, originated from our dormitory. There are those students who swore that oftentimes, late at night, they would wake up and see a nun dressed in black floating around the aisles between the bunk beds. We were often awakened in the middle of the night to the sound of something rolling down the concrete steps that led to the dormitory. It was as if a bowling ball was being rolled down the steps and paused for a short time on each step before bouncing to the next step. I heard that sound several times, and to this day none of the students have ever figured out what was making those chilling sounds. There was one very spooky reality that every student had to experience. In the dark of the night, after all of us had finally fallen asleep, we would wake up to the squeak of leather shoes pacing between the rows of our bunk beds. We would listen and pull the covers over our heads, but we knew it was just a Jesuit prefect, trying to walk silently between the rows of our beds in the dorm to check on the students. But I'll never forget how spooky that squeaky sound was in the dark hours of the night. Across America, there are spooky stories about Indian hospitals and BIA Indian school boards. The Indian Health Service Hospital in Rapid City, South Dakota, known locally as Soy San, can be a perfect spooky place for those working the late night shift. There are sounds of people talking and babies crying that the Soy San employees swear that they've heard. The former Stewart Indian School in Nevada had been subject of haunting stories. Visitors to the school, now closed, swear they can hear children laughing and crying and these sounds echoing through the empty halls. Stories of spirits and ghosts were common on the reservation. Every community had its own story. But the one that rings true to me, because I lived in that community, was a story that was born at Wounded Knee. The elders would sit on benches in front of the Wounded Knee trading post on warm summer evenings when I was a boy and talk in whispers. My father worked for the Gildersleeve family, the owner of the trading post, and we would live in one of the cabins in the community. I used to listen with interest and fear as they talked about the bitter cold nights in December when the cries of the frightened women and the terrifying screams of the children could be heard echoing through the woods and canyons around Wounded Knee. The massacre at Wounded Knee happened on a freezing winter day on December 29th, 1890. Perhaps it was the suggestion of the elders that became reality to me, because one winter night in December, I swear I could hear these mournful and frightening sounds outside of my cabin window. I pulled the covers over my head and listened, and then I wondered if it was just the wind in the trees that had frightened me. We moved to Tucson in 1988 and bought an old single-wide trailer that had an additional build on it. The master bedroom was at the end of a long hallway. Quite often at night, when our children were asleep in their beds, my husband and I would hear someone running up and down the hallway, but we never saw anyone there. Other nights I'd see a large man standing over me on my side of the bed. He wore a red flannel shirt and he just would stand there, staring at me all night. My husband never saw him and would often pass it off as me dreaming. All of us would jokingly refer to our ghost from time to time, but we never felt threatened or afraid. One year we asked a friend to take care of our house and feed our cats while we were on a 2-week vacation. We were horrified upon our return to find cat poop, cat food, and salt strewn all over the house. We immediately called our friend. Sandy said she would explain everything, but refused to come over to our house. The first day she took care of our cats, she felt very uncomfortable, unwelcomed, and the hair stood up on her neck. The next day she came over with a friend, whom she did not tell what she had experienced the day before, because she thought that she was just being silly. When they got to the house, her friend stopped dead at the door and refused to go in. Sandy went in and had all the same fears again. Later, Sandy's friend said that there was an evil presence in the house that did not want them there, and that she knew of someone who would know what to do. That person advised that they'd spread salt around the inside perimeter of the house, light sage sticks, and tell the spirits to move on. They did everything that they were told, but still felt too creeped out to continue going into the house. They simply tossed the food to the cats. About a year later, we decided to sell the house. Our real estate agent was repeatedly told that the potential buyers didn't feel comfortable with the house. One lady came over with her infant and her mother-in-law, and the infant started screaming as soon as they walked into the house. When they walked out again, the baby stopped. At that point, the mother-in-law took the child, went straight to the car, and yelled to her daughter-in-law that it was time to go. That was the final straw for me. I went back into the house and yelled that we were moving regardless of what he wanted. That was our decision, and if he wanted to go with us, that was fine, but he had to quit interfering with our house sale. 2 days later, we had a cash offer on the house and moved out 2 weeks later. My wife and I live in Atlanta, but we go back home to Washington State during the summer. We were asked this past summer to be lighthouse keepers in Westport, Washington. That is my wife's hometown. The lighthouse is the tallest in Washington and 108 years old. Our first day alone, we would walk in and hear pounding up at the top. Assuming that someone was up there working, I climbed 135 steps up. There was no one up there, so we assumed it was just the wind. But it stopped once I got to the top landing. My wife remembers knowing it was haunted all of her life. There were some times that her family members would walk by the lighthouse and see a man at the top, looking down. The very next morning, we would walk in and it sounded like he was moving furniture all over the place at the top. It went on and on. Every time I would come back down, it would start all over again and we would start feeling cold winds go past us. We finally got used to him, and every morning he would tell us good morning by pounding or moving furniture around. We will be going back next summer, and the three of us will have another good month. Oh, and by the way, the lights in the lens room was floating in mercury until they figured out that it was dangerous, and the lighthouse keepers were going crazy. Something that the lighthouse is haunted by one of the keepers who went mad and killed himself there. My ghost story took place right here in Tucson about 20 years ago. One Halloween weekend, I moved into an older house down by the wash at the river in Craycroft. Because of misunderstandings with the previous tenant, the electricity wasn't going to be turned on until the next following Monday, so I would spend my days unpacking, and in the evenings I'd start a big fire in the fireplace and cook. Then I'd sit by the light of the fire to read. At that time, I was reading World's End by T.C. Doyle, a ghost story set in the Hudson Valley, where I come from and where my family has lived for generations. I remember those dark evening hours spent reading by the fire as giving me so much of a feeling of home and peace. I lived in that house for several months without incident. The following summer, I went back east for 3 weeks to spend time with my family. There was a young woman who worked with me that I felt would be a responsible house sitter and would take care of my cat while I was gone. She lived at a home with a large family, and I thought she would enjoy being on her own for a few weeks. Once a week I would call her and check up on how things were going. The first week when I talked to her, she told me that she thought my house was haunted. I brushed off the idea. I'd been living in that house for 9 months without anything odd happening. Surely I would know if my house was haunted. She wasn't used to being home alone. Perhaps the normal house noises were what was frightening her. She didn't say anything more about it, but any time after that first week when I tried to call, there was no answer. When I returned to work after my vacation, I kept getting odd looks from my coworkers and comments about how they heard my house was haunted. I didn't really take any of it seriously, and I told them that. But a week after I returned, I woke up one night from a sound sleep to find someone sitting on the end of my bed, telling me to get up and let's find my cat in the house. The foot of my bed was towards the window, and I could see this person clearly outlined against the light that was coming in, with my cat behind him on the outside sill. I kind of sleepily argued with him that my cat was just fine outside where he was, until I realized that the normally quiet, calm cat he was actually howling out the window. So I finally said, "Oh, all right," to the man sitting on the end of my bed. I threw back the covers, got up, and went to let the cat in. It was as I started back down the hall to my bed that I had the "oh my gosh" moment, and I realized that I had just been having a conversation without speaking out loud with someone who really ought to not have been there. And of course, when I got back to my bedroom, he was gone. The next day when I got into work, the first thing I did was go to the girl and apologize to her. I told her what had happened, and I said, "I believe you now." That was when she told me about the incidences of the things moving in the house, the feeling that she had been being watched while she was there, trying to sleep or doing artwork, things like that. It seemed that after the first week she was so disturbed by what was happening, she could no longer sleep in the house. She would only go by each day to feed the cat and check on the house. She refused to go into any further detail, but it was plain to me that she was scared out of her mind. A few days later, on the advice of another coworker, I went to see a psychic. It was my first time visiting a psychic, and I was rather skeptical, but I figured something had to be done, and talking to her would be a good place to start, as any. She immediately described my house, where it was located, its construction, how many rooms it had, and where it was in relation to each other. She told me that there was indeed someone in my house and proceeded to describe them for me. It was a young man that I had seen. The psychic laughed and said, "Oh, and he and your house sitter really didn't get along that well. They went at it, and he did everything he could to drive her out." Our family ghost story started back in 1991 when my husband was watching TV and a ball rolled in from the kitchen to the living room. At the time we had no pets in the house and all of our kids were in bed, as I was. From that moment on, we had more strange things happening. A handprint smudge appeared on the mirror in the bathroom later that year. It was between the size of our 8-year-old and 3-year-old sons. In the spring of 1995, I noticed that the children's swings moving at night, when there was no wind in that area. The summer of 1995 brought more strange things when my mom had our radio to mellow music and she came back to find the channel had changed to rock. It had also gone from FM to AM. And she also found a sock in the middle of the floor when it had not been there the day before. One night in July, I went to check on my daughter and her toy stroller had been moved out, as was her dresser drawer. I had made sure before bedtime everything was picked up. We have also had other things that were slightly out of place, such as a basketball, a small desk, and a baby bop. In September of 1999, I had just come home from work when I felt a cold breeze on my neck. That same September, I was getting ready for church when my closet door pushed out. I thought it was just a cat, and I said, "Okay, get out of there." Well, no cat came out, which really spooked me. In 2002, my boy saw a little boy standing in his room at night. We think it is a small boy, as it has always been attracted to my kids and their things. Our little ghost boy, as we refer to him, does not scare us, but as the kids have grown up and out, we don't really notice things as often as when they were younger. In October of 2004, my husband, Dennis, and I decided to celebrate his birthday with a train ride through Verde Canyon. We would board the train at Clarkdale, which is about 15 minutes from Jerome, so I went online for a list of places to stay. The Ghost City Inn in Jerome had a nice ring to it since Jerome was a ghost town for many years. I spoke with the owner, Jackie, and told her that we would like the nicest room. She suggested the Verde View room, which is on the second floor with a small balcony that looks out over the vast Verde Valley. We left Tucson at about 9 a.m. for a leisurely drive north and followed the signs to the turnoff to go to the Mingus Mountain. When we got to the top, right there in front of us stood the Ghost City Inn. It is an imposing structure, built in 1890, as a boarding house for mine employees. Mrs. Garcia had owned the boarding house, and she was slightly over 4 feet tall and had a big heart. When we checked in, Jackie said, "Oh, by the way, the room is rumored to be haunted." We laughed and said, "Oh good, maybe we'll be lucky enough to see a ghost." Halloween is celebrated the entire month of October in Jerome. all buildings, trees, and vehicles are decorated. On this Saturday night, ghost walkers, residents dressed in costumes, and going up and down streets were out. There was a nip in the air as we walked back to the B&B after our dinner to get our bags ready for the morning. A few hours later, I woke up and saw Dennis sitting on my side of the bed, but as I looked closer, I realized that he didn't look like Dennis. I looked over my shoulder at the other side of the bed, and there was my husband, fast asleep. I turned back around and the stranger was still there. He was tall with dark hair and eyes, wearing a white satin shirt with a pattern of a red rose. He sat there for maybe a minute or so, and then he was gone. There was nothing at all frightening about him. The next morning I said, "Dennis, the strangest thing happened last night." He said, "To me also." He went on to tell me how he awoke and felt a soft hand touching one of his hands, and then the other. He thought it was me until he realized that this hand was quite small. It was a comforting touch, and he fell back asleep. When we went downstairs for breakfast, we told Jackie. She said, "It's the gambler." She hadn't told us when we arrived the previous day who haunted the inn, and now she told us the gambler had been seen on the balcony of the room we were in, but never inside. As some of you may know, England is very rich with history, a very bloody history, that is. Needless to say, England is not a stranger to ghost stories. Having grown up here, I have a couple, but for the sake of time, I'll only share one. This one took place when I was a teenager, working in the city. I won't tell you the name of my city, but after hearing the description, you could probably guess it. I was working as a barista in a not-so-busy part of town. This was both good and bad for me. Good because I'm pretty lazy and didn't want to work, but bad because it was bad for business and my tips. The location, however, was quite unique. Our building sat on top of a World War II bunker for civilians when they were being air raided by the Germans. Our basement had a tunneling system that connected all the businesses underneath. As cool as this sounds, it's actually kinda creepy. We didn't keep that much inventory in our basement. In fact, all that was down there was a fuse box and maybe a couple of boxes. However, if and when the fuse would blow, one of us would have to go down into the basement. What makes this so creepy is that the tunnels are pretty dark and allegedly haunted. Luckily for me, the first 2 years I worked there, I was not allowed to go into the basement. This is because only managers in our store were allowed to. However, once I got promoted to manager, everything changed. The first 6 months of being manager were great. I enjoyed the extra pay and did not have to go down to the basement for anything. However, everything changed when we got a new set of coffee makers. If we had more than 3 coffee makers going on at the same time, it would blow a fuse and turn off all of our power. This would then require me to go into the basement and find the fuse box and flip the fuse. Like I said earlier, the basement was an old war tunnel and connected to other businesses on our street. This was kinda cool that we all shared this basement tunnel together, but also kind of spooky. Whenever I'd go into the basement for any reason, I would always get this weird feeling in the back of my neck. It was kind of like static electricity, right before you're about to touch something metallic, like this buildup of energy. Anyways, back to my story. It was a dark afternoon. Well, I should say darker, considering England's pretty overcast for most of the year. It was our second week with the coffee makers. The fuse would blow about every other day, and we hadn't yet realized why it was doing that. I went down into the basement. The basement was eerily dark. The only source of light I had was a tiny flashlight that I had on my keychain. Needless to say, I was pretty spooked going down into the basement. Like I said, the basement was the tunnel that connected all the businesses above, so once I made it to the bottom of the stairs, I began my walk down the tunnel. The LED flashlight on my keychain that my mother gave to me for Christmas was proving quite useful, and yet I was not able to see that far down into the tunnel. As I was walking to the fuse box, that feeling of static electricity came to the back of my neck. For some reason, this would always heighten my senses, as if I was trying to look or to hear for something that was with me in the tunnel. I reached the fuse box and I opened it. There was a special sequence I had to do to get the fuses to work again, and I was trying to remember. While I was doing that, I could have sworn I heard someone walking down the tunnel. This was a good ways away, and it sounded like someone was slowly walking towards me, as if they didn't want to be heard. This made me nervous, and I tried my best to get the fuses working again. The sound of someone walking got louder and louder, as if whoever was down here with me was getting pretty close. I checked once or twice with my flashlight, but I never saw anyone down there. Granted, my flashlight only probably had about 20 feet of visibility. That's not very far. I then began to hear what sounded like someone whispering. Right when the whispering was getting louder, I was able to fix the fuse box and turn the breakers back on. The lights in the tunnel lit up and I was able to see I was in the tunnel alone. I quickly made my way up the stairs and into the cafe. After an hour or two of replaying the moments in my mind, I then began to realize that the tunnel was pretty old and carried sound very well. The walking sound that I heard that sounded like it was in the tunnel was probably from above. Same thing for the whispering. 3 days later, the same thing happened. The fuse went out and I had to go back into the basement. Except this time, I came prepared and brought a real flashlight instead of the dinky one on my keychain. I slowly crept into the basement, remembering the events only days earlier. I shined my flashlight all the way down into the tunnel and I could barely make out the other end. I was clearly alone in the tunnel, but it was always good just to make sure. As I began walking over to the fuse box, that same feeling on my neck began, except this time it was accompanied by this strong feeling of evil. I could tell whatever it was wanted to hurt me. I quickly jogged over to the fuse box. By this time, I was practically a pro, and it did not take me much time to get the lights back on. Instead of hearing sounds in the tunnel, I instead saw something. At the end of the tunnel looked like what appeared to be a man. It was at a distance at which you almost had to squint your eyes. This tunnel was accessible to the other businesses that were above it, so the idea that someone else was down there wasn't completely foreign. However, it was kinda creepy that he was down there in the dark. Being slightly creeped out, I gave a slight wave to ease my nerves. The man at the other end didn't wave. He just stood there. I quickly ran up the stairs and back into the cafe. I have since quit the cafe, and I sometimes think back about my experiences down in those tunnels. I often wonder what was down there with me in the darkness. This story I'm about to tell you is very odd. I'm not exactly sure if you'd classify it as a glitch in the Matrix or even a paranormal story. Anyways, here's the story. My wife's side of the family is quite eccentric, as well as very rich. One of my wife's aunts died, one I never got to meet. My wife did love her, but she did mention that her aunt was quite crazy. She would tell me stories of how her aunt would let her drink wine at the age of 10 and other crazy things. She also said that her aunt thought she was a witch. I'm not exactly sure why someone would want to think that about themselves, but family is family. My wife comes home one day with a couple of the items that her aunt had left her. When I say a couple of items, I mean a whole truck full. I wasn't exactly excited about this, but whatever. I went out to my wife's truck and helped her unpack some of the things. Some of the things were not that unusual, like a blender or a toaster. One thing that did catch my eye was this full-body mirror. The reason I say that is because the mirror had the head of a goat embedded at the top of the frame. Talk about Creepsville. As I was helping my wife unload the truck, I accidentally dropped one of the lamps from her aunt. When I went back to pick up the lamp, I accidentally cut myself on one of the sharp edges. It wasn't much, but it did draw blood. We put most of the items inside our house. Anything that was creepy or old, we left outside in the trash bins. This included the creepy mirror that my wife brought. As I carried it off into the trash, it felt like it was slightly vibrating. The bleeding from my hand had gotten slightly worse and some of the blood had gotten onto the mirror. I don't know why, but for some reason, this really freaked me out. Before I went inside, my wife insisted that we covered the mirror with a tarp. My wife claimed that this mirror was her aunt's portal to the dark dimension. If it was ever left uncovered for too long, things could come out of it.
We covered the mirror and we spent the rest of the day sorting the items inside. This is when things began to get weird. I went to the bathroom and afterwards I went to wash my hands. I glanced into the mirror and things seemed off. Whatever I did in real life appeared to be about 2 seconds slower in the mirror. I quickly grabbed my wife to show her and, of course, things were normal again. My wife obviously thought that I was crazy. Things got much worse from there. Late at night, me and my wife would wake up to the sound of a faucet being left on in the bathroom. Both of us just figured that the other one had left it on while they were a little bit sleepy. This didn't quite make sense since both of us went to bed at the same time, and we would have heard if the faucet was still left on. The faucet would only turn on late at night. It got to the point to where me and my wife decided to set up a GoPro to see if we could capture what was going on. We set the GoPro up and we went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, again with the faucet being left on. I jumped up almost excited to run to turn off the faucet to see what was captured on the GoPro. The way the GoPro was situated was that it was able to capture the faucet as well as part of the mirror. I fast forwarded to the part to where the faucet would turn on, and to my horror, I found what was happening. In the part of the mirror, I could see what looked like me reaching through the mirror to turn on the faucet. I'm not exactly sure what to do with this information. I used to live next to a cemetery that I was able to see from my window. The cemetery was kinda cool. It was very large and had very cool headstones. Unfortunately, the cemetery would be closed by 8 o'clock. However, I remember growing up and seeing lights coming from the cemetery well past 8. These lights were often very erratic. To add to the creepy factor of the cemetery, once the cemetery was closed, it would appear that a fog would fall over the cemetery. My theory about the lights would be that cars would drive by and the fog would catch it, making it look like the lights were coming from the cemetery. In actuality, they were coming from the streets nearby. Granted, we did live on a very unbusy road and we would rarely see cars driving, hardly ever at night. My friends and I were very fascinated with the paranormal. During sleepovers, my friends would come over and we would stay the night in my basement. The basement would be unfinished and my friends would bring over a Ouija board. We would turn the lights off and light candles around the board. We would sometimes get responses from spirits, but these weren't exactly breakthrough responses. The spirits that we seemed to have contacted would only respond in yes or no, nothing very indicative of an actual spirit, or not one that we could prove at least. My one friend then came up with the brilliant idea to take the Ouija board session out into the cemetery. We then devised a plan to find our way inside the cemetery late at night. We decided that around 1 a.m. we would jump the fence and enter the cemetery. As we went outside, I glanced over to the graveyard. Surprisingly enough, the fog was actually not as pronounced as it normally was, but there was still a slight mist in the air. We were able to hop the fence quite easily, since the fence was only shoulder height. We then did our best to find the center of the graveyard, and that's where we placed the Ouija board. We decided against the candles, since we did not want to give away our position to an onlooker or maybe a security guard. Again, the air in the cemetery was pretty much clear, except for the slight mist. But as soon as we started asking questions, a fog in the air began to build. We started our session and immediately we started getting responses. Instead of getting our typical yes/no answers, we were now getting more lengthy answers. We spoke to one spirit that claimed to live a couple streets away from me, and he died in a car crash just on the other side of town. We then began to talk to what sounded like a child. The spirit said it died at a young age and that it was looking for its mother. As we continued to talk to the spirit, it told us that we needed to stop talking and to leave the cemetery. Naturally, we asked why. The young child responded that there was a spirit behind us that wanted to hurt us. We were quite spooked by this, and we decided that it was time for us to pack up. As we packed up, we were able to look around the graveyard. We began to see shadows peering out from behind tombstones. As we were making our way over the fence, My friends swore that they could hear their names being called from inside the cemetery. We all quickly hopped the fence and made it over to my house. We decided that we had too much excitement for one night and that we decided to go to bed. We went into my room and got ready for the evening. As we were getting ready, I peered out into the cemetery. Instead of seeing the random lights from the cemetery, I began to see shadows. They were peering over the wall. Ever since that night, instead of seeing the lights, the shadows would appear. Some inside the cemetery, others would be seen in my yard, as if they were coming closer. I think that my friends and I made a mistake by giving attention to the spirits and acknowledging their presence. By doing so, this gave them abilities to form into our world and they are able to feed off of my energy. My one friend that was with us that night claimed that she would receive phone calls, but no one would be on the other end. These phone calls would be around 1 a.m., roughly the same time that we were inside the cemetery. Ever since then, my friends would never come over to my house, and I don't blame them. Hopefully the activity that I've been seeing doesn't get worse.
This story was told to me by one of my friend's stepdads. He referred to it as the basement door. He said that not too long ago, his brother asked him to stay in his house and help watch over the 2 cats that he owned. He agreed, considering it was closer to work for him, and also that the apartment complex that he was staying at was currently being worked on. So, in actuality, this was in everyone's best interest. He went over to his brother's house, and his brother gave him the grand tour. It was his quaint little 2-story house. While in the laundry room during the tour, the brother opened a door which surprisingly led to a secret basement that he had no idea about. This was very odd, considering that he had been there multiple times and that he had no idea that this house had a basement. They both descend into the dark basement below, and when they reach the bottom, the one brother reaches up and pulls on the light to turn it on. The light illuminates most of the basement with this dull orange glow. The basement is unfinished, and there's nothing down there other than the circuit board and a couple of boxes. There is, however, a door in the corner of the basement with no door handle, but just a hole where the door handle should be. The brother then tells him that there's nothing behind that door that he needs to worry about, and in fact that he's never been able to open that door. They then go back upstairs and finish the rest of the tour, which does not take very long. The brother then leaves, and my friend's stepdad has the whole place to himself. He feeds the cats and let them out to go to the restroom, and spends a couple of hours just relaxing and watching TV. Around 8:30 or 9, he hears a very peculiar sound coming from back of the house. What was that? He thought to himself. He gets up and investigates, thinking that some of the cats must have gotten into something that they should not have. He soon finds out that the cats are asleep upstairs. More anxious than ever, he continues to investigate around the house. He soon then finds the source of the sound. It was the basement door, and it's wide open. He peers down the long, dark stairway and sees nothing. He fumbles around for the light, and then he remembers that the light is at the bottom of the stairs. Naturally, he decides that investigating the basement at night might not be his best option. He then closes the door and makes sure that he hears the latch click and goes back to watch TV. A couple of hours pass, and around midnight he hears the very similar sound again. Having heard that sound already, he already knew to go to the laundry room, and sure enough, the basement door is wide open, yet again. This time, instead of peering down into the stairway, he promptly closes the door firmly and places a heavy bag of cat food in front of it. At this moment, he gets a very odd feeling. It was as if someone was standing on the other side of the basement door, and that person hated him. He then goes upstairs and gets ready for bed, not being able to shake that feeling still. He doesn't remember falling asleep, but he remembers the dream. It was a very odd dream. The dream was a man with a bag on his head was prompting him to come down into the basement. He knew that in his mind that was a terrible idea and that he did not want to go. But for some reason, in his dream, he just did it. He followed him slowly into the basement. He noticed that when he was walking down the stairs into the basement, the man with the bag on his head was pointing to something. In his dream, he finally reaches the bottom of the stairs, and the man with the bag on his head touches him. Right when he touches him, he is jolted from his dream to find that he's not in his bed. He is standing in this dark place, and he has no idea where he is. As his eyes adjust, he is able to see some light coming from what seems to be above him. As he's fumbling around to go towards the light, it finally dawns on him where he is. He is in the basement. He then immediately sprints up the stairs as fast as he can. He finally reaches the top and tries to open the door, but feels resistance on it. His heart is racing 1,000 miles an hour, and he finally gets the door open. He then bursts through the door like a madman and closes it behind him. He looks down to see what it was that was in the way at the door. It was that bag of cat food that he placed in front of it earlier. What is going on? He thinks to himself. He then walks out into the kitchen and glances upon the microwave to see what time it is. It's 4:12 in the morning. How did he walk all the way down the stairs and move the bag of cat food without waking up? More importantly, how did that bag of cat food get moved back in front of the door? His heart is finally calming down and his mind is no longer racing. He is now able to think more clearly. He then realizes that this is not his first time sleepwalking, and he figures that the bag of cat food maybe got caught on a mat or something, and was able to be pulled when the door was closed. Surprisingly enough, this is not enough to shake him from staying in this place. He figures that he might as well just stay up the rest of the day and go to work at 6. So he does just that and goes to work and forgets all about what happened the night before. He comes home after a long day of work and feeds the cats and lets them out. As he's feeding the cats, he glances into the laundry room. Sure enough, the basement door is in fact closed. What a sigh of relief. That whole evening, everything goes along perfectly. He even mentioned how he kind of felt a little silly, how he worked himself up so much. He then spends the rest of the evening playing Xbox 360. He stays up a little too late considering it was a work night, which was around 1 o'clock, and gets ready for bed. He falls asleep and has this really weird dream. He has this dream that he's watching these Salem witch trials. It's a very graphic dream, and feels all too real. At one point, they bring out a man and put a bag on his head. They then crush him to death with stones, and then the bag turns red. The dream then takes a weird turn in that he's back in his brother's house. He is in the basement. The single bulb is lighting the basement. His attention is being placed on the door without the doorknob. Right then and there, he is awoken again. It is completely dark. It takes him only a couple of seconds before he realizes where he is. And this time, there is no light above to guide him to the stairs. He is in a lot deeper into the basement because he can feel boxes around him. He knows that the light is above one of the sets of boxes, so he reaches above his head. Sure enough, he finds the light and pulls on the chain. When the lights come on, to his horror, he sees that there's a black mass, like a mist, floating in front of the door that was not able to be opened. The door is wide open. Right then, the bulb breaks, and he hears a loud scream. He then finds his way to the stairs and sprints up the stairs, practically breaking down the door. He then just gets his car keys in his wallet and leaves for his own house. He doesn't go back to the house until a day before his brother comes back. He just checks on the cats very briefly and makes sure that the cats didn't leave a mess in the house. A day later, the brother comes home and calls him and says, "Hey, let's go get a beer." They meet up at the local bar and have a beer, and the brother asks him, "So, how was it staying at the place?" He said that he straight up told him that he could not stay the whole time because of interfering conflicts. The brother then looks down at his beer and says quietly, "Did you have the dreams?" I then broke down and told him everything that happened in that house. He felt bad for bringing me into it, and he told me that he was soon planning on selling the house, right when his new one is ready. I then asked him if everything about that door was true. He then admitted that he lied about the door, saying that he couldn't open it, when in actuality, he could. It was because of that door, and since that he opened it, that he'd been having those dreams. I then nervously asked him what was behind it. His answer sent shivers down my spine. He told me, "Large stones."
The night before my experience, I had been the target of poltergeist activity. I do not mean the mischievous kind of poltergeist. The presence in the room was downright evil. That's another story, but I do believe the events were related. The night I had my experience, I went out to the bathroom. This was in the middle of the night, around 1 or 2 a.m. As I walked into the kitchen, the bathroom is connected to the kitchen in my house, go figure. I was still a bit jumpy because of the previous night. Therefore, I turned on every light on my way to the bathroom. When I walked into the kitchen and reached for the light, a shadow oozed out of the sink. I told myself it was just my imagination until I turned around and it came towards me. There were glowing red eyes glaring at me from the area the face should have been. The feeling I got was a definite presence of evil, again like the night before. I screamed and ran out of the room. I then spent the rest of the night in my parents' room on the floor. What was it that I saw in my kitchen that night? It was probably 20 years ago, back in 1999. I don't recall the month, when I was living in a rental mobile home in San Antonio, Texas. My ex-girlfriend and I experienced a shadow person in the form of a child. It was early in the morning, about 3 or 4 a.m., when my ex and I were in the living room sleeping on the floor, when all of a sudden I just woke up. I opened my eyes and in front of me was a shadow that looked like a little boy. It was just a dark black that you could not describe. It had no physical appearance of clothing or anything. It was just pure darkness. It was facing me for a few seconds when it took off running to my right, down the hallway. The hallway light was at the end at the time, and I could see the shadow running very clearly. When it ran off, all I could hear were footsteps being created as it ran down the hallway. The noise sounded like feet running across a wooden floor, but the weird thing was that the floor was carpeted, and it also had a plastic vinyl cover, so we couldn't get the carpet dirty. At that time, I was so scared that when I saw it, I didn't move. Another weird thing about the experience was that my ex had woken up at the same time. When it ran off, all I heard was, "Did you see that?" I knew I wasn't the only one that had seen it, and that it wasn't just my imagination. After that, we both stayed awake the rest of the morning, just trying to understand what had just happened. My ex would always tell me that she would hear a scratching noise coming from outside, but I didn't believe her. But this had gotten my attention. After this, I never experienced another encounter with the shadow person. A couple of months later, we moved. A few months before my mother died, she and my sister were discussing strange happenings at her old home. My mother stated that she had seen a dark shape originate from the closet in her bedroom several times. She then proceeded to describe this thing as appearing to be wearing a dark cowl covering the upper torso. My sister was amazed by my mother's description. My sister said that she remembered that figure standing over her crib and poking her with a bony finger. They called me and asked if I had any sightings in the house, and I told them of the shadow being that was constantly standing at the foot of my bed. I was so afraid of the night that I would cover my head with my covers, making a makeshift blindfold.
I remember some nights I would get courage and try to look out from under my blindfold. And of course, the lady was still standing there, watching me sleep. My brother also told us of a little man that would come out of his closet just about every night and stay in his room. His shadow figure was more viewable. My brother was even allowed to describe the fine details of this shadow figure's hat. All of us will admit to the fact that going up to our rooms, a sense of anxiety would start at the base of your feet as you started up the steps. You would get a false sense of relief having been able to check out your room in the light prior to any of the shadow figures having entered during the night. Believe it or not, after all these years, it still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it.
About a week ago, a coworker and I were chatting, and I mentioned how much I enjoyed reading and watching things about the paranormal. He said he had taken an interest in it as well, because he and his wife actually lived in a haunted house. It's weird that, because I've known him for so long, that I am now just figuring this out for the first time. His wife showed up to pick him up from work, and they both began to tell me about their home. She began to describe some of the things that they had seen and heard, and invited me over to see if maybe we could find something. Last night was the only night he and I had the same evening off, so he gave me directions to his home, and I showed up to his place around 8:30. We ordered a pizza and had some beers, and basically laughed and joked the entire time. Around 10:30, I was like, well, nothing had happened, so I guess I should get going. Before I left, my friend said that I should see his manga collection, so I was like, okay, cool. He took me into a spare bedroom where he keeps all of his collectibles. And while we were in there, I look up and see his wife's face go white as a sheet. She's looking behind us, facing the door. I see my friend turn his head and his jaw just drops. I slowly turn my head, and right there in the doorway, 5 feet from us, is a solid black outline of a person, just standing there. We stared at it for a good minute, not saying a word. It gradually just faded away. Then we all look at each other, just awestruck. They had never actually seen anything like that before. Mostly just sounds and smells, maybe some feelings here and there, but nothing like this. I was around 4 or 5 years old. I have a great memory. It's kinda creepy to some, because I have a photographic memory. Anyways, the house I lived in, my brother and I swore to be haunted. The basement was the worst. Picture this. You walk down a set of stairs, you look to your right and it's a rumpus room. Ahead of you is a doorway to the laundry room, and to the left is a hallway. At the end of the hall are 2 rooms, one on your left and one on your right. My older brother stayed on the room on the left. His friends would never sleep over because of a shadowy figure in his closet, always staring at them. The room on the right is where my uncle stayed. Now this is where it gets pretty weird. My older brother was babysitting my twin brother and I, and we all played hide and seek. My twin and I went hiding, while my older brother was seeking. I ran into my uncle's room on the right, and into his closet. I sat down on the floor, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. At that time, I thought it was my twin brother. I remember asking him, "Hiding in here too?" To which there was no reply. 5 minutes passed and I felt cold. I left the closet thinking that my brother was gonna follow me. I went upstairs to the living room and saw both my brothers sitting there on the couch, asking where I had hid. They couldn't believe where I told them because they think that the basement is generally creepy. Fast forward a few nights. My older brother was babysitting again, only my twin brother went grocery shopping with my mother and uncle around 7 p.m. We were roughhousing and wrestling in his room. We acted like we wrestled outside the ring and into my uncle's room, which we considered a backstage. Mid-wrestle, the closet door swung open on its own like a blast of wind. My brother and I stopped wrestling and stared in awe. A tall, dark shadow man walks out of the closet. My brother books it out of the room, leaving me behind. The shadow figure walks up to me and stops right in front of me. I proceed to run out of the room and down the hallway, up the stairs, and then by my uncle, mother, and my twin. We later moved from that house because my mother said that the rent went too high. A few years ago, I get around to asking my uncle if his room was creepy in that house. He told me that yes, his closet would open on its own in the middle of the night. He told me that a shadow man would sometimes walk out of his closet and would sometimes stand at the foot of his bed. Now he also told me that this shadow figure wasn't evil and that he had a comforting presence, so he didn't complain very much. The shadow figure only came around once every few weeks. My uncle then told me about the house's grim history and told me the real reason we moved. My uncle's closet had a cubbyhole which led underneath the house and conjoined my brother and uncle's closet together, which made one long closet. A man was murdered in that house in the 70s, and his body was found in the cubbyhole. My mother found out and freaked out, causing us to move, blaming it on the high rent. I have always been open spiritually, especially as a kid, having seen ghosts and spirits before. But nothing compares to this shadow person I saw when I was 13. For starters, I don't even know what to call it. I have done a lot of research trying to make sense of these things, but I have no idea. They are not ghosts or spirits, I know that for sure. What I saw was not something in the corner of my eye, or something that looked white and transparent like I've seen previously. These entities are basically a black mass. I will do my best to explain what I had seen. I was trying to sleep, tossing and turning, and I turned over on my opposite side to face my doorway, which was on the other side of the room. My door was wide open because I was a frightened kid, especially of the night, because I always saw stuff standing in my doorway. What I had saw was a black figure of a man about 6 feet tall. The black figure of the man stood with his arms by his side, and you could not see through him. It looked three-dimensional. This figure didn't have a hat or red eyes like I've read other people have seen. It was just a silhouette of a man. I sat up as soon as I saw it, and I stared at it for a good 5 seconds. Mind you, as strange as this is, I wasn't really scared for some reason, and I can't explain why. Anyways, I asked what was wrong, as I assumed it was my mother. When I got no reply, I assumed that it was my brother and asked him the same thing. Still no reply. By that point I had realized what was happening, and I was crapping myself. I pulled the covers over my head, and I looked up 10 seconds later. It was gone. I broke into the basement of my high school back in January with my friend. We got down there by sticking something into the elevator key slot. I've always been sensitive to energies, so when I heard rumors about the basement being haunted, considering I'm a total sucker for all things creepy, I just had to go. Long story short, we got caught, and I think something followed us out. I believe it was a shadow person, and by the way its energy feels, it's definitely not good. I stopped noticing it for a while until about a week ago. Its energy pretty much hit me like a brick to the chest. It seems stronger now, and because I've been dealing with a lot of depression in the past month, it most likely feeds off my negative energy. I just really need help being only a freshman in high school. If you have any suggestions on how to get rid of it, it would greatly be appreciated. When I was in 6th grade, as I recall, about 11 years old, I was invited to a barbecue at a local park by a fellow classmate. After a day of playing, as most kids tend to do, it was time to go home. We were tasked with collecting all of my friends' younger brothers and sisters. There were 4 of us, all the same age, and we were looking for 7 or so younger children. The park wasn't too huge, and there was only a brick building which served as a restroom for park goers. The kids weren't that difficult to find, but this is where things get paranormal. Halfway through the park, we see a dark figure of what appears to be a small child. Thinking it was one of the siblings we were looking for, we naturally start running towards it. At this point, the figure is making a dash towards the back of the park, so we give chase and start yelling at the child to stop. As this dark-colored figure is reaching the end, the most effed up, completely spooky thing I've ever seen in my life ensues next. The dark childlike figure turns white. It then starts running on all fours and runs up a tree. It uses the elevation of the tree to jump over the wall and over to the next apartment complex. I'm just really glad that whatever we were chasing didn't chase us.